news to some of you. He's a partner in a Washington-based law firm and served as a deputy assistant legal advisor for the U.S. Department of State, and has been chairman of the Board of Trustees since 2014. And also providing a few introductory words will be Heba Ali, who's the director of the New Humanitarian, the New Humanitarian, formerly known as IRIN News. And she is a journalist who spent more than a decade reporting from conflict zones in the Middle East and Africa and Central Asia for various publications, including, I noted the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, so I'm going to assume you're Canadian. Hello. Once upon a time, I was too. And various other outlets. And has received a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting for work in Northern Sudan. We'll then pass the floor to J.J. Messner, the executive director of the Fund for Peace, who I think is the sort of pilot in the cockpit of the report, and he's been the executive director also since 2014, I believe, after having worked for the program of the Fund for Peace, various programs before that, and he still also leads the work on training and implementation on voluntary principles on security and human rights, and the Human Rights and Business Roundtable, which is of interest. Business and Conflict Nexus is of interest to some of you. So these are going to be the first lineup, and then I'll be joined, and I'll introduce her later, Josephine Schmidt, as we do our little panel discussion. So first, over to you, George.
Thank you, Keith. I was going to start off with maybe a few words in French, but I won't do that. No. Probably because I think you would find that my French is a little too, I guess the word would be fragile for today's event, but nonetheless. Really on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Fund for Peace, I really want to extend our thanks to the Graduate Institute for the opportunity to present the 2019 Fragile State Index here. It's really an honor to be here with you and with also with our friends, and it's probably my daughter dialing in or something, wanting to hear her dad speak, I suspect. It's live stream. And also very happy to be here with my friends from the New Humanitarian, and it's really wonderful to be partnering with you all on this event as well. At the Fund for Peace, much of our work focuses on conflict assessment, early warning, where we look for practical and real-world ways to address a lot of the problems, and where we try to help local partners bring together tools to address conflict situations in their own area. The Fund for Peace was founded over 60 years ago, but over the last 15 years, at least, we have focused heavily in the area of fragile states, and over the last 13 years, we have produced annually the Fragile State Index. But for us, the Fragile State Index is more than just a sort of a research tool or a one-year headline event to get a few articles in the newspaper about what we do. We have used the methodology underlining and supporting the index, and we've taken it into the field, we have adapted it, we have expanded it, and most of all, we have really tried to give real-world application to what the Fragile State Index is all about. And let me just give you two very brief examples. In the 15 countries of ECOWAS, of the Economic Community of West Africa, we have worked to develop a conflict and early warning response system that is based on a deep data analysis of local conflict events, coupled with extensive field interviews with local stakeholders. And now that is up and running in, I think, 14 or perhaps all 15 countries in West Africa. In Nigeria, and specifically in the Niger Delta, we have worked for a number of years to build, with local partners, a comprehensive peace mapping system where we have integrated over 24,000 different conflict incident reports, coupled that again with extensive field work, and give local peacemakers real-time access to identify areas of conflict hotspots in their communities so that they may then begin to address those in a timely fashion. And we have done the same thing in northern Nigeria, developing a tool to help local peacemakers there identify conflict hotspots specifically related to violence against women and girls. And most recently, we are now working across the continent in Africa with the Africa Development Bank, again, to take the methodology of the Fragile State Index and to help development planners think about how they need to incorporate various elements into their development projects that will help build resilience into those development projects and address some of the fragile issues that we've identified there in connection with, again, with our local partners. So what we've done is, as I said, taken what we believe is a very effective and promising tool, tried to take it into the field and give it real live application. But today you will hear really about the results of the Fragile State Index, and as I know you will hear from JJ Mesner, it's really not about the score, it's not about the rank, it's not about who's on top or who's on bottom. I would encourage you all to really look behind the data, to go onto the website. We have now a very interactive website where the data is all presented, and to find out ways that you might use the tool both in your research and many of you who will be going into the field and doing work in peacekeeping and how it could be applied and tools like it to the work that you are doing, because I think we all share a very common passion for peace building and making this world more conflict-free. So thank you again so much for the opportunity to be here today, and look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and I will repeat the thanks for being here with us. As a news organization that produces journalism from the heart of humanitarian crises, the New Humanitarian has been reporting on fragile states for nearly 25 years. And it seems to me that it's only now that the world is really waking up to the risks posed by fragile states. Fragile states are the countries of origin for most of the refugees that have fled to Europe and beyond in unprecedented numbers. Fragile states are the largest obstacle to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and fragile states are home to some of the largest humanitarian crises on Earth. Our reporting has, over the years, documented rising fragility in countries like Yemen, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we've tried to analyze the root drivers of conflict, examine intensifying drivers like the climate change, examine the lack of aid and the impact of aid in some of these long-running crises, and most of all, tell the stories of the people that are caught up in these places. In an age when mainstream media is very focused on Trump and on Brexit, we are trying to shine a light on stories that have slipped out of the headlines in an effort to keep these issues on the agenda. And today we have something of a new challenge, and Keith mentioned off the top that we recently rebranded. So we have, until 2 weeks ago, been known as IRIN News, and are today the New Humanitarian, in an effort to, among other things, recognize the changing landscape in which humanitarian crises take place. And by that I mean that gone are the days when most humanitarian needs were caused as a result of natural disasters, where aid workers would pop in to the scene of an earthquake or a tsunami, save lives, and then pack up and leave. Today, most humanitarian action takes place in fragile states where protracted conflict create need for decades on end, and where short-term aid is delivered year after year for decades on end. And that really just doesn't cut it anymore in this day and age. Fragile states require a different kind of response, a new way of thinking, a new way of operating. So the New Humanitarian seeks to chronicle the changing threats that the world is facing, but also the new ways in which the world needs to be responding, and to provide a platform for a conversation around how to do things differently. So we're very pleased to be partnering for the first time with the Fund for Peace and the Fragile States Index, a partnership that we hope to grow over time, and that I hope you will join us in following, in an effort to really raise awareness and understanding of this critical issue of our time. And from our side, to really examine what humanitarian action and humanitarianism means in an age of fragility. Where the index brings a robust and methodological, data-driven approach, as George outlined, we tell the human stories behind those numbers of the people that are caught up in these countries in an effort to achieve our mission, which is to put this kind of quality, independent journalism at the service of some of the most vulnerable people on Earth. And catch up with my colleague Sarah at the back afterwards, but she used to work in the peacebuilding field and related the words of a Somali colleague. I'm sure, Akim, you also heard this story, that failed state does not denote a failed people, and I think we would argue the same for fragility. I personally have met many people in fragile states that are anything but fragile, and we seek to tell their stories. So thank you for joining us, and please do take a look at our website for more of the reporting that we have done on this issue and on the Fragile States Index in particular.
Okay, well, the floor is now yours, JJ, to give us a quick rundown. I'm going to move off here so I can see your slides.
Well, first of all, welcome to all of you for attending the first ever launch of the Fragile States Index that we've held outside of the United States, which for us is a very exciting development. And it also marks the 15th anniversary of the Fragile States Index. I'd like to thank George for your opening remarks and your continued support of the organization and of our work. I'd like to thank the Graduate Institute for this wonderful venue, and also the New Humanitarian for what I hope will be the beginnings of a long and fruitful partnership. And also congratulations to the New Humanitarian on your rebranding. It's really very flashy. If you have not already seen the New Humanitarian's coverage, I would strongly recommend that you do so, and especially the really cool graphics that have recently been tweeted. I'd also like to thank the staff at Fund for Peace, the team that's behind this, particularly led by Charles Fiertz, for making the Fragile States Index possible. We have a very multinational team. We have folks from Australia, the United States, Nigeria, Togo, Ethiopia, Ghana, Switzerland, India, Tunisia. So a very multinational team that is behind the index. When we speak of state fragility, what do we actually mean? There are many and varied definitions of a fragile state. According to the OECD, a state is fragile when it is unable or unwilling to perform the functions necessary for poverty reduction, the promotion of development, protection of the population, and the observance of human rights. In other words, fragility occurs where the state is unable to perform the basic functions in the areas of security, rule of law, and basic social services. We would add to that the inability for collective and inclusive decision-making. Fragile states are unable to develop constructive and interactive relations, not only with their own populations, but with other countries as well. But regardless of definition, for people living in the most fragile states, their lives can be beset by poverty, inequality, violence, displacement, and often oppression as well. Fragile states are also vulnerable ones. Where shocks occur, be they natural or man-made, they can be especially vulnerable, lacking the capacity or capability to absorb or adapt to those shocks. Fragile states also affect their neighbours. Take regional instability and the way in which Somalia's fragility impacts on its neighbour Kenya. There are many other examples around the world just like it. Or refugee flows, where vast numbers of people fleeing from one country into another can cause significant pressure, say like a country like Jordan, which experiences significant pressure from the number of refugee flows from the Palestinian territories, or likewise Lebanon right now with refugee flows from Syria. Worse still, fragility, poverty, and violence form a vicious cycle. When state structures are weak and it is no longer possible to guarantee basic public services or to provide security, conflicts often escalate. It is only through the development of legitimate institutional capacity and an active civil society that this vicious cycle can be broken. But how do you measure it? How do you measure state fragility? Firstly, we need to recognize that all countries experience some level of social, economic, or political pressure. What differentiates countries is their relative level of fragility versus their resilience or capacity to respond to shocks. But when does a risk become a crisis? Where should we be focusing our efforts? And where are the trends? Where is there improvement and where should we be worried? These are the key questions in seeking to respond to fragility. We need to know the specific context, the ability to withstand or respond to shocks or crises, specific social, economic, and political trends, and the dynamic drivers of risk. These issues require quantitative metrics on areas that really are fundamentally qualitative in nature. It is relatively straightforward to measure infant mortality, or GDP, or kilometres of road built. But how do you measure quantitatively rule of law, or group grievance, or factionalised elites? Fragility also requires discussions and judgments on issues that are often politically sensitive. So how do you ensure objectivity of analysis? Basically, what we need is monitoring and evaluation for countries. As much as the Fragile States Index may appear to be an index, and in fairness, that is what we call it, what it boils down to is M&E for 178 countries on their social, economic, and political fragility. Perhaps unique among indices, the framework of indicators underlying the Fragile States Index actually predates the index by over a decade. The CAST framework was developed in the mid-1990s to assist practitioners with a methodology for measuring and understanding conflict, and it was only in 2005 that we imagined repurposing the CAST framework to measure countries globally. And so we have the 12 indicators that you see on the screen right now. The cohesion indicators, security apparatus, factionalized elites and group grievance. The political indicators of state legitimacy, public services, and human rights and rule of law. The economic indicators of economic decline, uneven economic development, and human flight. The social indicators of demographic pressures and refugees and IDPs. And finally, the cross-cutting indicator of external intervention. Every year, we use a process that triangulates quantitative data sets with qualitative assessment and a process of content analysis that, using complex algorithms, maps our 137 sub-indicators to over 50 million data points every year. This triangulated process not only provides us with the ability to conduct relatively objective analysis, but it also allows us to quantify data that is fundamentally qualitative. So what are our major findings for the 2019 Fragile States Index? Well, first of all, there's a couple of different ways to look at the Fragile States Index, and George has already alluded to this in his welcoming remarks. One is to look at the top and the bottom. This year, Yemen has ranked as the most fragile country by virtue of its civil war that has escalated into a humanitarian disaster. This is the first year that Yemen has ranked as the most fragile state, and in so doing, it becomes only the fourth country in the history of the index to do so. Meanwhile, at the other end of the index, Finland has ranked as the least fragile for the 7th year in a row. But as much as it is interesting to look at the rankings, I would argue that it is not the most useful aspect of the index. It does not take the Fund for Peace to tell you that Yemen is a fragile state. And though it might be helpful to know the levels of relative fragility in various countries across standard indicators, ultimately the real utility of this analysis is comparing countries against themselves over time. Perhaps our most interesting finding of 2019 is the sheer number of countries that are getting better. When we are bombarded by a constant news stream of 24-hour news peddling continual doom and gloom about the state and future of the world, it is easy to forget the long-term arc of development. Now, certainly, countries move at different paces, and naturally there will always be setbacks, shocks, and pressures. Of course, around the world, there is still widespread fragility and vulnerability, plenty of poverty and inequality, and conflict and illiberalism. But broadly speaking, over the long term, the Fragile States Index demonstrates this year that the world is becoming steadily less fragile. It often takes cold, hard data to demonstrate that for all the negative press, there is significant progress occurring in the background. It is perhaps ironic that the Fragile States Index is telling us that overall the world is less fragile this year than it was last year. But sadly, though, that optimistic view is not applicable universally. We are seeing a growing division between the majority of the world that is slowly progressing and a handful of countries that are following a solid trend in the opposite direction. 9 of the 20 most worsened countries in 2019 were in the same category in 2018. 3 of those countries, namely Brazil, the United States, and Venezuela, have been among the 20 most worsened countries for each of the last 3 years. Indeed, Brazil and Venezuela tied this year for the most significant worsening since 2018. Though much attention has been paid recently to the dysfunction of the regime of Nicolas Maduro, and even to his legitimacy as president of Venezuela in the first place, our data suggests that much of the worsening trend in Venezuela actually goes beyond politics alone and is being recorded in areas such as demographics and health. Literally speaking, Venezuela is rapidly getting sicker. And though Brazil tied with Venezuela for most worsened country in 2019, arguably its proximity to the growing instability in neighboring Venezuela was likely enough to tip the balance. Nevertheless, Brazil's internal challenges remain significant, with tumultuous politics and a new president, Jair Bolsonaro, who came to power through a campaign fueled by harsh right-wing rhetoric. The country's poor performance is deeply rooted in a general economic malaise, rampant corruption, and crumbling public services that have seen Brazil's Fragile States Index score worsen for 6 straight years. But developed countries are not immune from worsening trends. This year, the United Kingdom is the 4th most worsened country and is now ranked as the 15th most worsened over the last decade. Much of the current turmoil can be attributed to the country's farcical efforts to make good on a 2016 referendum, where after a highly divisive campaign, a slim majority of Britons voted in favour of leaving the European Union. Nevertheless, it is important to recognise that Brexit is still a relatively new phenomenon, and much of the long-term worsening for the United Kingdom was in train well before the referendum. This is a long-term trend in the United Kingdom. However, overall, most countries improved in 2019. After having ranked as the most worsened country in the 2017 Fragile States Index, Ethiopia has staged a remarkable turnaround this year, ranking as the most improved country in the wake of the ambitious reform agenda of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed that has led to more political and social inclusiveness, breaking down of the previous ethnocentric system that the country endured for decades. Ethiopia has also benefited from and contributed to a decrease in regional tension, marked by a détente with neighbouring Eritrea, with whom Ethiopia fought a war only 2 decades ago. Other countries, such as Kenya and Gambia, have also demonstrated recoveries after previous crises. Though the rate of change may not be sufficiently fast to rate among any top lists, a couple of quiet improvements in the 2019 index are truly remarkable. Throughout the life of the Fragile States Index, there has been considerable interest in the number of African countries that are ranked as highly fragile. Indeed, among the 30 most fragile countries in the 29 Fragile States Index, 21 of them are to be found in Africa. So much that in previous years, the Fragile States Index has even been accused of having an anti-Africa bias. And yet, in 2019, an African nation has, for the first time, ranked in the very stable category, with Mauritius ascending to join the likes of the United Kingdom and the United States. Indeed, if the year-on-year changes of 2019 are repeated in 2020, Mauritius, a member of both the African Union and the Southern African Development Community, could easily rank better than the United States and the United Kingdom in the 2020 index. And by no means is Mauritius alone. Both Botswana and the Seychelles now rank in the stable category, demonstrating the increasing level of stability in parts of Africa. Just as Mauritius this year became the first African country to break through the very stable category, it is also important to recognise that Singapore became the first Asian nation to move into the sustainable category. As previously discussed, It is, however, the long-term trends that are the strongest indicator of a country's performance. Over the long term, Libya continued to rank as the most worsened country of the past decade, closely followed by Syria, Mali, and Yemen, as all four countries find themselves embroiled in ongoing civil conflict. Notably, the ranking of Venezuela as the fifth most worsened country since 2009 demonstrates how the country's current woes are the result of a severe long-term worsening trend. Indeed, Venezuela is the most worsened country in the past 5 years since 2014. Over the long term, former Soviet states continue to dominate the list of most improved countries, with Belarus, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan all ranking among the top 20 most improved. Of course, it is important to recognize that among the most improved countries are some that continue to be restrictive, autocratic, and subject to closed civic space. Herein lies an important distinction in reducing fragility over time. When countries begin from a poor starting point, significant gains are much easier to detect and measure. Even relatively simple reforms can greatly reduce a country's fragility. The same can be said for others among the top 20 that are post-conflict countries, such as Colombia and Sri Lanka. In recovering from conflict, simply not being at war is pretty obviously a significant improvement. It is therefore likely no accident that former Soviet states, as well as post-conflict countries, are among the most improved since their rate of change has been faster. However, whether this trend can continue without more fundamental political, economic, or social change is as yet unclear. In giving you the highlights of the 2019 Fragile States Index, we do not pretend to have all the answers. Indeed, we are certain that there are plenty of interesting and maybe even critical trends that we just haven't discovered yet. We encourage you to look at the data and to draw your own conclusions. And we encourage you to go beyond the top-level data, which is really just an average. We encourage you to look at the indicators themselves. Now, take Sudan, for example. Though overall Sudan has slightly improved in 2019, a focus on some key indicators, such as state legitimacy, human rights and rule of law, demographic pressures, and refugees and IDPs are on a worsening trend. But that is not obvious from simply looking at the total score. Diving into the individual indicator scores and looking at individual indicator trends can tell you a much deeper story. We also encourage you to use the data in a way that works for you. All of our indicators are weighted equally, not because we think they should be, but because we think it would be subjective on our part to assign weights to specific indicators. But you can go to our website and use the MyFSI app, which allows you to weight the indicators as you wish. You can see how that changes a country's total score, and also how it changes a country's ranking relative to its peers based on the way that you have weighted the various indicators. I would like to thank you again for being part of our 15th anniversary and our first overseas launch of the Fragile States Index. We hope that we can continue to provide a useful tool to practitioners and policymakers. The data of the Fragile States Index suggests that the majority of countries are slowly but surely making their way along that arc and providing a more hopeful future for their people. Certainly, there is still much conflict, poverty, and inequality in the world. There is still significant fragility, risk, and vulnerability. But that arc of development is long and it is slow. And we need data to demonstrate this for us, both where the world is worsening, but also where it's improving. Thank you.
Shortcut. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask now Josephine Schmidt to join us here. Josephine is the executive editor of the New Humanitarian and joined IRIN, as it was previously named, in 2018, but before that spent 17 years working in various places and various capacities for the New York Times and with other media organizations, and I think has a wealth of experience in some of the fine-grained places that we're going to talk about, details. Okay, so I'm going to move off here. We're going to do a little bit of roundtable, and then we're going to have open for questions, and we have plenty of time. so the first thing that I want to do here, and it's a little bit irresistible, is to talk about the bird's eye view that is presented by the report. I know you say that, of course, it's designed primarily to allow a focus on individual countries and trends over time, and I appreciate that that's something you can now do after 15 years. But that's not what's going to get the headlines, right? It is going to be a little bit of the league tables, who's up and who's down, and how does that work. So I think it's worth just getting a few reflections on how some of those choices, and I guess they're bigger than individual choices, and how is the data mined in order to give you some of those choices. And I notice, and I can't resist this, that you did highlight the UK in your presentation. In the report itself, it mentioned several times, and you mentioned in passing the United States as well as being a country that deteriorated 3 consecutive years. So how should we think about exactly what kind of assessments go into individual states and their rankings thereof? And is it really worthwhile to start questioning who's going up, who's going down? Why, for example, is Hungary actually marked as improving, which is a judgment that several people would dispute. I know that's a bit unfair because I'm asking you to be an expert on everything that's in there. But you put yourself out here for that today, so do your best. And then I'm going to turn to Josephine for some reactions about some of the findings.
Well, first of all, I think on the rankings themselves, obviously it is always a temptation with these kinds of data sets to look at them as a league table. We would strongly advise otherwise, and I think that now that we have 15 years of data, it is much more possible to have a nuanced view of the index and to actually look at those trends rather than the league table, as it were. And I think that increasingly we have noticed over the last decade that there is significantly less focus on the top and bottom of the index, and that is to be welcomed, I think. Insofar as how the data is mined, I think what really makes the Fragile States Index somewhat unique, well, there's 2 things really. One that I alluded to before is the way in which the index was conceived of. Because most often when organizations, institutions will look to create an index, they'll think, we want to measure X. So let's try and find indicators that will measure X. Let's try and find a methodology. Whereas the Fragile States Index was developed backwards. We actually had the framework for roughly 10 years as a practitioner's framework for conflict assessment that we were then approached to see whether it would be possible to repurpose that framework for an index. And so in that sense, it was a framework that had been used in the field for roughly a decade before it actually became an index. But we found that the sheer amount of data that was necessary to process for such a vast spectrum of different indicators, it couldn't be done by humans. And so that's when we decided that this really needed to be largely automated. And that is the second part that really, I think, sets the FSI apart, which is a large part of it is based off of content analysis. So we developed a series of algorithms that allows us to scan at least 10,000 different data sources every year. We as a content aggregator. And then we, from those 10,000 different sources, we then scan at least 50 million data points. And a data point can be a report, it can be an article, what have you. 50 million of those a year to come up with what we call saliency, to understand how much certain indicators affect different countries. And so we're then able to put each country on a scale for each of those sub-indicators. And fortunately, I think that that gives us as objective as possible. I'm not going to say objective. I'm going to say as objective as possible viewpoint. Because obviously, at some point, somebody had to make the judgment call of these are the 12 indicators. And that is going to be inherently bringing those preconceptions with them. Insofar as individual countries are concerned, I think that that again is where the long-term trends are really most important. So take Hungary versus Poland, for example. We were actually kind of surprised that, that Hungary did improve slightly this year. And that happens in the data, where when you average out the 12 indicators, sometimes countries that you expect would be worsening might actually improve for a year. And that is the nature of many countries. Some will worsen, 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 improve, and then worsen, worsen again, or the other way around. Hungary versus Poland is an interesting one, because when we looked at the two countries and how they seem to share some similarities in the paths that they seem to be respectively going down, what we found is that Poland is following almost the same trajectory as Hungary on certain indicators, about 3 years behind. And so what's interesting to us is that Poland continued to worsen this year as Hungary sort of flattened out. Now, what's going to be interesting for us in the next couple of years is to see, assuming things don't change in either Hungary or Poland, is seeing whether that trajectory does flatten out. And if so, it might actually reinforce a theory that we're starting to develop for some countries, wherein they move between certain parameters. And it takes a significant shock to move them out of a certain bracket. Now, what I mean by that is that even for a country like Hungary that has been worsening significantly for a European country, the mere fact that it is within the European Union, there are certain safeguards around the amount that it can worsen and the speed that it can worsen, that perhaps the brakes have been put on. But there again, if Hungary worsens again next year, that theory might be blown out of the water, we'll see. But nevertheless, that is what the data is able to do for us. It takes out that subjective view of, well, we think Hungary should be worsening, but actually the data is saying that it's flattening out.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that we started not discussing African states. And Josephine, if you want to respond on Hungary versus Poland, that's fine. But I also wanted you to pick one or two examples, perhaps from the report, where they do actually develop short narrative around particular countries, or where your experience and the experience of the new humanitarian reporting might tell you or give you a slightly different picture. And here I'm thinking of Somalia in particular, if you want to comment on that, which is listed as low and stuck in near the bottom. But your narrative is, understanding resilience, and it's a much more hopeful story that you present briefly than your data does. So how are we supposed to think about this, and what can we add when we actually get down there in the field? Talking perhaps to the people who are producing the very data that you are then processing in your algorithm.
Thank you. I like the point about us producing the very data that you're processing, because I think one of the great synergies between what we do and what FSI does is that we're both taking long-term views of situations, but our view is from a much different vantage point, in that we are on the ground. And the people whose stories we're telling and we're reporting on are often themselves contributors to many of the indicators that make up the FSI and other sort of data analyses, from brain drain to refugees and IDPs. I think there's no surprise if you're going to look at the FSI in terms of the countries that are at the top, which have scaled the misery index, as it were, to be named most fragile. And it's also no surprise that much of our coverage mirrors this, because that's our business. We cover humanitarian crises. I think two things to keep in mind when looking at what we do and what FSI does. One is that I think FSI, your indicators are for the year past, they're lagging indicators. So you're really offering a sense of time-lapse photography. And what we offer is more of a very well-curated Instagram feed without any filters, of course. These aren't one-offs, and they are Instagram feeds for which this time-lapse photography offers great context, but it is very much in real time on the ground. And the second thing to keep in mind is just it's just our vantage point. I mean, one can be in Kinshasa, in Kinshasa or in North Kivu, and the view is going to be very, very different. We, for the most part, are going to be in North Kivu because we put our journalism at the service of people in some of the most vulnerable situations. So that said, I think what we do is we ground truth the data. We're not looking at the numbers so much as the lives behind them, the lives that help to determine that data. You know, I was interested to see Venezuela, of course, because it's no surprise that it has fallen in fragility. I suppose a surprise from our vantage point would be, well, why isn't it much nearer the top? And there are many reasons for that, in part because it started much closer to the bottom. But we are, and it was also interesting to hear you talk about health and demographics as being some of the key indicators that led to that increase in fragility, because our reporting over the past year has focused very much on those two areas. We were lucky enough or resourceful enough to have a reporter who was actually reporting from within Venezuela and was able to travel throughout the country. And the stories that she brought back from people who had been from all walks of life, all economic strata, and were now really living in a situation they could never, ever imagine in terms of health care, in terms of being able to take care of their kids, in terms of being able to feed their families, really brought to life the sense that a country is becoming more fragile. We've also seen, as you pointed out, a number of other Latin American countries have increased in fragility. Our reporting in Latin America over the last few years, unsurprisingly, has increased quite a lot and will continue to increase. There are knock-on effects, of course, from Venezuela everywhere from Brazil to Peru to Colombia, but there are also many other things going on, such as increased violence, such as climate displacement and other impacts from climate change. So we are focusing on those indicators and on what they mean to people's lives on the ground. I'll just mention one other country that was interesting from our vantage point, and if you haven't yet, please check out our package called Tipping Points, which is on thenewhumanitarian.com, where we take much of the data from the Fragile States Index and put our reporting up against it, and also look at it in terms of how it can inform humanitarian response and prevention. So one country that stood out to us was Ethiopia, because it's a success story in the Fragile States Index, most improved, which is surely good news. And that analysis follows almost all the mainstream press that one has seen on Ethiopia over the last year or more. Yet to us, things don't look so improved yet. And in a way, it's unfair to say, there's a new prime minister and things are different now. However, to us on the ground, what we're still seeing are intercommunal tensions, huge problems, huge numbers of refugees and IDPs whose needs are not yet addressed. And to us, these are warning signs that, yes, this is a pivotal year for Ethiopia, but some of these strains and stressors which led to great calamity in the first place are still very much there.
Thank you for that. I'm going to bounce off one comment you made and refer to the OECD report as well. You pointed out that you're in the North Kivu and not in Kinshasa, or that your journalist is working in the countryside in Venezuela, not just in Caracas. The OECD report on states of fragility chose to focus to some extent, well, first off, fragile contexts, which might be politically correctness as opposed to actually wanting to single out countries, but also on fragile cities, as a recognition that the country unit isn't really necessarily the right way to think about all of these things. So I wonder how you guys at the Fund for Peace have grappled with this, because I think Josephine has made a very strong point here that fragility looks very different depending on where you are in a country. And then I want to follow up with a question, maybe not about an Instagram feed, but about the sort of the video that comes with this.
And if you don't mind, I'll just jump in for a second, which is to say I think the point of city versus rural is very important, but increasingly we're seeing the urbanization of humanitarian crises as well, and that is something that our reporting is looking at as well.
No, I think that that's an excellent point about the issue between fragile cities versus fragile contexts, however you want to define it. One of the challenges that we face, I think, is trying to fit analysis into predefined units of analysis. And in one sense, that is the nation state. And yet we know that fragility is not confined within borders. Often fragility is fundamentally transnational. And although, on the other hand, you look at a country like DRC, you look at many other countries where the level of fragility varies greatly from one corner of the country to the other. I mean, if you look at a country like DRC and the difference between, say, the northwest of the country versus, say, the Kivus, the distance between there is the same from London to Athens. And yet, you know, if we look in the European context, there's what, 20 countries between London and Athens? And yet in DRC, it is one country. And so we're talking fundamentally about a national average that we're looking at. So in that regard, it's helpful, but it's not 100% representative. And so in some of the work that George referred to in his opening remarks, in some of the work that we're also undertaking at Fund for Peace, where we're doing conflict assessments throughout West Africa through the 15 states of ECOWAS, we are looking at the community level, or the district level, because you really have to get a full fundamental view of not only the level of fragility, but also the level of resilience that's in societies. And resilience, I think, is one of the other things that we really need to talk about, because fragility is really only half of the proposition here. The other half is, of course, the resilience, the level of capacity that a society has to be able to deal with shocks. And I think that one of the leading institutions on this at the moment is the African Development Bank, that has really, in the way that it looks at emerging markets, the way it looks at different contexts, it's really trying to focus not just on issues of vulnerability, but as much on issues of resilience as well. And I think that is perhaps one of the most important next steps that we really need to take in this kind of analysis.
Okay. Do you want to add to anything to that one? Okay, I'm going to do one more quick round and then get this a bit more interactive. So if you have questions, now would be a good time to start formulating them in your minds. And we will have a couple of people with microphones in the room. But I wanted to ask a little bit about the trend analysis that you highlighted as probably one of the most important features, because what I would like is a presentation that actually did the trends, perhaps broken up geographically or by sub-region or by key countries. And you referred to that, but I suspect you've done some of this. And so what can you tell us about that to some extent? You know, what are the broader patterns? And you made one reference in the presentation, which was that the majority of countries are slowly moving, you know, along this arc of development. Here I would ask the exact same issue that you raised, which is the country the right unit here? It matters a great deal if it's Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa, or India going down, and a lot less, with all due respect, if it's you know, 4 Central American countries. So if you're counting countries to assess whether we're on this arc of development, I wonder what it looks like if you did populations to some extent. So tell me a bit about the trends, and tell me a bit about that. And I struck also because Josephine's narrative was in part that the world doesn't look like it's getting any better. And we could take a vote on that in the room. I don't know where we'd come out, but you two may not share the same view on this one.
So first of all, on some of the trends that we're looking at, I would absolutely agree that that countries aren't always the best unit of analysis, and there's a great quote attributed to Winston Churchill, who once said that democracy is the worst form of governance except for all the others. And I think that in terms of a practical sense, measuring countries as your unit of analysis is, at a global level, the least ideal. but it's so more impractical at this point to be able to define cities, for example, and exactly how to analyze those, or to even have enough data to be able to meaningfully analyze provinces or districts. Hopefully we'll get there at some point. But in terms of trends, during my presentation, one of the things that I discussed was the encouragement for everyone to use our data and to really mine it for what you find in your own analysis, because we've found repeatedly that we don't know half of the trends that are in the data. We know what we think we should look for, but there has been many occasions where certain events have happened in various countries. We haven't necessarily expected it at Fund for Peace, but we've gone back and looked at the trends and found out that actually it was just a country that we weren't focused on, and had we've known to look at the trends, we actually would have been able to do some level of early warning. The UK is actually a really good example of that, because before the Brexit referendum, we weren't really looking at developed countries. When you have limited bandwidth, you look at the countries that you think you should be looking at. When the Brexit referendum happened, we thought that we should look into the data for the UK and see if there was anything that that would suggest that there was some sort of forewarning. And given that the Brexit referendum was highly divisive, it was, shall we say, based on a number of divisive issues that were perhaps less germane to the issue at hand, we looked into the indicators and we found that across the social cohesion indicators, so group grievance, security apparatus, factionalized elites, the UK was the 7th most worsened country in the world over the preceding 5 years, and matched only by the likes, in terms of rate of change, matched only by the likes of Libya, Syria, Yemen, and so forth. I mean, that is incredible. And we didn't think to look for that trend until after the event happened. So those trends, there may be trends in the data right now that we don't know are there, so we encourage you to look. But one of the other challenges too is the difference between improvement and worsening. In that for a country to worsen rapidly, a country can literally fall off a cliff. So take some of the countries of the Arab Spring, for example. Libya had not an ideal situation before the Arab Spring, but it was a negative kind of stability. Whereas when the wheels fell off for Libya, they well and truly fell off, and as is no accident, Libya is the most worsened country for the past decade. It rocketed up the index. Sort of a similar issue, a different way of looking at it is improvements. That so far as countries that worsen can do so very rapidly, it's rare for countries to improve rapidly. When countries improve, it is very, very, very excruciatingly slow. A good example that I often turn to is Sierra Leone. In the first Fragile States Index in 2005, Sierra Leone was, I think, the 4th or 5th most fragile country in the world. Now it's knocking on the door of the 40s. It has left the alert category. It's now in our warning category. It has migrated up the index relatively quickly. It's not been a straight trajectory. There are years where Sierra Leone gets worse, and then it gets better again, and then it gets worse. But over the long term, it is getting better. And I think that that's one of the key things that we need to recall when we look at these trends, that they're fundamentally different in terms of timeline for worsening versus improvement. The one other thing I would just touch on briefly on Venezuela again is I think that Venezuela is a really good example of how relatively stable countries can slip backwards very quickly. Because, and I was reminded of this when I was watching an interview on BBC of the author Isabel Allende, and she was talking about when her family fled Chile after the overthrow of Salvador Allende. Her family fled to Venezuela because Venezuela was the shining light of democracy and stability in Latin America. Venezuela was the first country in the world to eradicate malaria. And now look where we are. It is a country that is the most worsened for the last 5 years. It's one of the most worsened for the past decade. There are people who are walking 18 miles just to get water. There are Venezuelans who are fleeing the country, causing enormous regional instability in Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia. And this is a country that only a few decades ago we would have said was the stable beacon of Latin America. So I think that that is also a lesson that when we look at long-term trends, that nothing is forever.
The world does not look quite so positive from the New Humanitarian's perspective, or are you going to rally to the
Well,
arc?
I think we have to remember that our business is not a business that is a bright one. It's our business to cover humanitarian crises. So what we're covering is going to be difficult, it's going to be challenges, and it's also our business to cover these crises not only as they occur, but to cover prevention, so to do early warning stories, and also to cover them after the last survivor has been found, after the peace deal has been signed, to tell the stories of people on the ground, and really to give a concrete sense of what peace means and what peace building means long after that agreement has been signed. I think that if you look at our coverage, you'll see that perhaps it's not, we talk about ups and downs and that we will cover ups and downs of fragile states, but our downs perhaps are not more downs, they're just different downs. So they're the downs of, say, South Sudan. So there's a peace agreement now. There's different thoughts on will it hold, will it not hold. But regardless, there's still a huge internally displaced population. There's still a huge percentage of people who are suffering from PTSD, and there's our handful, or perhaps one institution that can offer mental health care. So we can go from covering attacks by different militias, but then we'll move to covering, so how does a society rebuild itself when 60% of the members of that society are suffering from PTSD? I think, too, we look at, the Rohingya crisis grabbed headlines a couple years ago, and that's great, not the reasons that they grabbed headlines, but the coverage was great. We're still on it. It doesn't really make headlines much anymore. And in fact, we were on it way before those headlines started. So I think that when we say things don't look better, part of it is it's our job to find what's not looking better and to point to ways perhaps that our readers who happily are people who can look for ways to make that the horrors of the world a little bit better.
So New Humanitarian reporting should be extra weighted in your index. Okay, I have lots of other questions, but I'm not gonna monopolize this. So I'm gonna open the floor. There's 2 microphones, I think. One of them is right here. And we can share from this. So if anybody has any questions, we can start right here in the middle, and then we can work our way across. How's that? The second one here, and the third one back there. I'll take
Thank
them in
you.
groups.
Thank you for interesting panel, also presentation. I am Janice Ryu. I work at International Finance Corporation, which is the sister organization of the World Bank Group. And our team works for Africa's fragile situations, covering 21 countries in the continent. We already discussed about fragile state versus city or context or situations. And I was wondering, although your index there might be challenges, of course, to cover sub-national data or sub-regional data, but what would it take to produce that kind of indicators or data? IFC is the largest private sector investor in fragile countries. And as an investor, we look at different country ratings. But then, as an outsider, if you are not on the ground, you could be easily misled by country level ratings when there's a pocket of stability exists within the country and where the investment happens. So I think if we are really talking about contributing to SDGs and development of these countries, I think we should be able to mobilize your local networks or different data sources to produce this type of subnational and sub-regional data that could be very helpful for investors like us. And then second one is about resilience. I think that's a great point because we tend to, I mean, of course, talking about the new Humanitarian, we are a big fan of your news. We weekly feature those news to our internal audience. But then we tend to talk about challenges and difficulties, crisis. And I wonder, for investor point of view, resilience and pockets of hopes, I think that's what also we need to attract foreign direct investment or regional investors to these countries. So I wonder, since you are talking about early warning and also prevention, is there a way to balance or feature those prevention-related news more often? That would be my second question. And then thirdly, I wanted to actually highlight also Ethiopia case. I mean, what we hear from the region is that things are really getting difficult and complex because of IDPs. And I was also surprised to see the positive trend, although, of course, there are different reforms taking place. And all these things makes me wonder, how can you capture nuance of certain numbers? I mean, I think comparing countries over time totally makes sense, different indicators, different index. But then how can you also make sure people who are pressured with time, their focus span is so short, they will be easily attracted to the headlines rather than the underlying factors. So it's I'd like to just hear your thoughts and how can we move from here to focusing on resilience and also covering different contexts. Thanks. And also one clarification, actually, World Bank is I think the institution who introduced risk and resilience assessment before Africa Development Bank.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Defne Gönenç. I recently completed my PhD in political science at the Institute. 2 questions. The first one is brief. Do you include data about gender, particularly violence against women? The second question is, I think fragility causes among states might differ. What is very relevant in Europe may not be so in other contexts. So I wonder if you, for instance, include data about the data about suicide rates, youth unemployment, or for instance, the number of times an individual have to change jobs, which I expect to increase in the future because of robotization particularly. So your data set might reflect upcoming changes better. Thank you.
I'll take the third one from the gentleman behind, and then we'll do another round.
Great. My name is George Ainge-Parita. I'm with Veritas Global. We do economic analysis to identify how to shift the negotiation dynamics from a slicing the pie discussion to a growing the pie discussion among conflicting parties. Thank you for an excellent presentation and a thought-provoking discussion. That was really fantastic. I mean, looking at your index, it looks like really a wealth of knowledge and could be very useful to see how it maps across other indicators, particularly economic indicators. Have you done any work that maps your index with indicators like the economic growth or the Gini coefficient or measures that are commonly used in economic analysis? And if you haven't done those, have you partnered with anybody who has? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to suggest that since there were about 6 questions by 3 people, that we pick and choose a little bit so that I get more audience input. But who wants to lead on this one? There was some humanitarian questions. For you.
So working backwards, just first of all on, thank you for the kind words, just working backwards on the comparison between different indices and indicators. There is actually a professor at, I think, Dartmouth College in the US who has done a comparison between, I think, something like 20 different indices, including the Fragile States Index and another several similar ones, to try and find where the overlaps are, where the consistencies are, and so forth. Unfortunately, his name has completely slipped my mind, but needless to say, there is a comparison out there. It actually does make quite interesting reading. There is a working group in Washington that actually gets together relatively frequently. Once a year, they bring together all the different indices, including us, and we talk through a lot of the similar challenges that we have, where some of the overlaps are, and I think actually we're doing that again in a couple of weeks from now. So this is sort of index season. On issues like GBV, for example, a lot of those sub-indicators are wrapped up in the larger indicators. So, for example, gender-based violence, I believe, is under group grievance, and I think youth unemployment might be under demographic pressures. So a lot of those issues are picked up. They're just part of the larger indicators, and so they're not always quite so obvious or explicit. I was delighted to get a question from IFC. We've worked with IFC for many years, and they're an excellent institution to work with. And I think one of the key things that we've learned in working with the IFC is really how this kind of data should be used. I mean, particularly considering IFC's mandate to focus on, shall we say, emerging markets. Not using this kind of data as a green light, red light, but rather using it as a method for determining the level of due diligence that needs to take place for specific investments to ensure, A, that the investments are effective, but B, and more importantly, that they conform with the principles of do no harm. And I think that is, particularly for investors, that is, in my mind, exactly how this data should be used. We frequently get the question, well, if you are saying that X country is a fragile state, then surely you're turning away foreign direct investment. And my answer to that is, if that's the case, then the data is being used incorrectly, because it should not, first of all, you should use multiple data sets and triangulate them, but even beyond that, you should be using the data to inform the kinds of questions that you should be asking in terms of due diligence. What should you be looking at? When you do site assessments, what kind of conflict dynamics in the community should you be looking at? What sort of national trends should you be aware of as sort of a backdrop to those kinds of issues? And I think that IFC has been quite successful at that. And as I mentioned before, African Development Bank has been doing a lot of work on that as well. And I think that it really gets to a very key question of looking at investment in fragile states, because for many investors to look at a country like Syria, it would be a pretty tough sell for many investors to invest in any sort of project in Syria right now. But they have to eventually. And at some point, you have to move from aid to development. And one of the risks in conflict or post-conflict countries, particularly a country like Syria, is as much as food aid is important, it's also sacrificing the market of the agricultural sector. And you need to, and for countries coming out of a post-conflict situation, they're going to rely on economic growth to help build the country again. And when some of the most important sectors like agriculture are undercut by aid, then it makes it very difficult for them to grow. So then you have to ask the question, well, when is the right time to go in and invest? And hopefully data like this can be helpful in informing that decision. And hopefully it then also allows not only informing that decision, but for the due diligence to be done to ensure do no harm.
So I will address your two questions, on one on resilience and the other to address the idea of ensuring that there's nuance in our reporting or in reporting of humanitarian crises. I love the idea of having a feature on resilience. That, as we all know, has become a very trendy word these days through a number of different sectors. I think that our reporting, we spoke earlier about how we're in the business of covering humanitarian crises, and that is not in and of itself a happy business. However, that does not mean that all of our reporting needs to be on gloom and doom and what's going wrong. We do a number of stories on what's going right and what could be done to make more things go right in more places. We recently did a story out of Malawi, which was part of our cyclone coverage. And I think most cyclone coverage now, if there still is any after the immediate crisis has abated, focuses on ongoing needs and long-term perspective toward rebuilding, toward people reestablishing their livelihoods. And we're doing that also, and we'll continue to over the next weeks and months. But the piece we did the other day talked about why the response in Malawi was actually a bit faster and why fewer people died than had died in similar situations, in floods that had happened in 2015, and talked about a system that an alert system that had been put in place on the ground, and talked about methods that were used to stockpile goods and equipment well in advance of the worst of the storm, and the hope that those methods might be used in the future elsewhere. We also did a story out of Afghanistan late last year where there's a terrible drought. I think the statistics are that last year more people were displaced by drought than by conflict. And our reporter found that, in a few villages, people were staying, they weren't leaving, and we mentioned urban displacement a little earlier. People are going in drought-afflicted areas because their animals have died. They can't feed them anymore. They can't grow food. So they're going to cities where there are already huge communities of people who have returned from Pakistan and elsewhere, and they're adding to this humanitarian crisis. But our reporter found a few villages where people were staying and they were actually growing food. And that was because one small NGO had worked out a way to get water pumps there. And so we covered this with the hope that put this out there and make it known, maybe it will be replicated. I think to Heba's point earlier, we report on people who are among the most vulnerable in the world, who most of the time are in the midst of events that are the most traumatic of their lives. But that doesn't mean they are helpless or hopeless or victims. They are indeed some of the most resilient people you'll ever meet, and it's a privilege to tell their stories.
Thank you. I'll take another round of questions if there are some. This one over here.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm from Somalia, and I'm glad that we're not leading this year or last year as well. But at the same time, I shouldn't be happy that other countries miss this. I have concern about the way you rank the countries. As one of the questions was raising about does your data reflect on the reality on the ground? Because when I see where we are as a Somali, and we are ahead of countries like Syria, does that really reflect on the reality of the ground? Sometimes do you ask yourself what we found, or our conclusion, the data that we analyzed does not reflect on the countries that we put as top 3 or top 4? just like the ranking concept.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Do we have any other questions from this side here? Take one here, and
Achim Wennmann from the CCDP and also with the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform. I want to get into your conversation between the fund and the Fragile States Index and the Humanitarian, because that's what I really find interesting. How the national level data, the analysis, the abstract, and the kind of objective data converses with the human story. Because in that tension, in that illustration, there is, I think, a lot that can help us make sense of fragility and also perhaps inspire people to put more focus both on the human stories or also on the analysis that hopes to shape early warning and another analysis. So my question to you is, how do you work on that space in between so that those individuals, groups, and organizations that think about the world in state terms, in this kind of state-based map, which there are still many organizations who think that way, can become more sensitive towards the human element, and vice versa, where also those who are perhaps going understand more the world in micro terms, become more sensitive about the real power dimension of organizations that think about the world in state terms. What is in that conversations? How do you think you can shift the needle in working in that space in between your views?
Thanks, Katrina from Peace Nexus Foundation. I also find it fascinating to juxtapose the objective indicators versus the story, and that's we all work in stories. And the third category that in a way is missing here is just perceptions. I mean, perceptions polls in a way. So the quantitative view of subjective views. And I'm wondering, well, particularly for the index, do you have data sources that draw on those? And if yes, great. And have you also had, an attempt to do it through big data and including digital? And what is your experience with that?
okay, if you can pick up on those three, and then I will stick my last questions here. Okay.
Happy to start. I love your idea, your thought of helping to make sense of fragility and working in the in-between space. I think as journalists, it's our job to help make sense of the world. It's not our job to make predictions. It's not our job to create change. It's our job to provide information that hopefully will help make sense of the world. I think, and I don't have any magic answer for being able to meld perspectives that are completely based on data and numbers with perspectives that are completely heart. But I do think that that gray space you're talking about is the union of heart and head. And I do think that excellent journalism is able to bring both of those in. And that's something that the New Humanitarian has long done. And in fact, one of the reasons that I chose to come and work with the New Humanitarian to do more of that, because I think that it's a really special and unique thing to tell these stories of horrors that really most media and most people cannot ever, they can't imagine. They simply don't have the words to explain what's going on. And if they do, it's frightening, it's complex, you feel helpless. So what you get are headlines, you get the most fragile state, you get the worst humanitarian crisis, you get these platitudes, and they mean nothing. They say nothing to your heart. On the other side, there are numbers about millions and billions and hundreds of thousands, and that's all very useful, but then how does it pass the why does this matter test? So I think what we try to do is bring the why does this matter test to our work, and we start on the ground with people who are experiencing, who are in the midst of humanitarian crises, who need to be heard. And then we are very, very careful to be sure to contextualize what's going on, to be sure to add history, to be sure to look at the root causes, not to determine them, but to suggest what may be happening, and really to try to meld the heart and the head. One way we also try to do that is by hearing directly from people who are out there in the field working or who may be at their desks working. We have a feature called First Person, where we will have people give us their firsthand account of what's going on. We had one yesterday from a young woman, an 18-year-old woman in Sirte, Libya, who talked about how difficult it was for her how easy it was for her to leave, how difficult it was for her to come back. And we had a piece late last year from an aid worker, a Yemeni aid worker in Hodeidah, who spoke about as his city was coming under more and more attacks, how difficult it was for him not only to take care of his family, but to do his job, to bring food to his neighbors. And I think the ability to personalize these horrors with a phrase like "bring food to my neighbors" is what can really work in that gray space.
So first of all, on Somalia, I think that Somalia is a really good example of how we really need to, I mean, as much as we publish a ranking every year, and frankly, if we didn't do it, then other people would. But as much as we do publish a ranking every year, we do encourage people to look at countries in a manner that compares each country against itself more so than its peers. Because if you look at the countries that have occupied the top spot of the Fragile States Index for the past 15 years, it's been this year Yemen, also Somalia, South Sudan, and there's a fourth country that was top of the Fragile States Index. It was the most fragile country in our first index. Does anyone want to call out their guess as to which country they think it was? Any guesses? DRC. Any others? Iraq. I don't think anyone's going to get it. It was Cote d'Ivoire. And don't forget that it was in the wake of the civil war in Cote d'Ivoire that was occurring at the time. Now look where Cote d'Ivoire is. So all that to say, you look at the four countries that have occupied the top spot of the Fragile States Index: Somalia, South Sudan, Yemen, and Cote d'Ivoire. And between the four of them, they have almost nothing in common. So Somalia, Cote d'Ivoire, and South Sudan share a continent, but other than that, they have absolutely very little in common. And so that's why it's really important to look at countries as individual units and look at their performance over time. Also, when you aggregate 12 indicators into a total score, the weighting of indicators becomes an issue. For example, if you use the app on our website to weight the indicators differently, you might find Somalia in a very different position, just based on the way that the indicators are equally weighted. And also recognizing that countries that do face fragility can be slow to recover. So Somalia may be towards the fragile end of the index for some years to come. But if you look at a country like Cote d'Ivoire, where it was the top of the index 15 years ago, and now it's nowhere near the top of the index, there are significant movements over time. We actually did have a staff member who was doing a conflict and resilience assessment in Somalia only a few weeks ago. So we do, not that we derive the data from on the ground, because we simply don't have the resources to be able to send people on the ground everywhere, and if you can't do it everywhere, then it's not going to be consistent. But we do indirectly ground truth what we're finding. And in terms of resilience, there is actually an article on our website about Somalia this year that's focused on the level of resilience, because if you look at a country, fragility is often very state-centric, whereas resilience tends to be much more community-centric. And a country like Somalia, as fragile as it is at a state level, is extremely resilient at the community level. And so if we were to compare the fragility of Somalia versus the resilience of Somalis, I think you would get a very different proposition. And that also gets to the question of you know, looking at the national level versus the human story. And I think one of my favorite examples of where the Fragile States Index has led us over the years was recognizing that, you know, the political sensitivity of the Fragile States Index being what it is, we would get yelled at by many different governments. But then one day we were contacted by the Kenyan government, and they gave us a report that criticized some of our findings, but then agreed with many of our findings. And they actually used that as an entree to work with us and to work with Kenyan civil society to use the data of the Fragile States Index as a platform for discussion. Not looking at the data as the final point, but seeing it as the entry point. It is the point at which you start that discussion. And so being able to involve civil society with the government to be able to talk about where the fragility exists and how we can collectively face those challenges, I think is very, very effective. One thing I would talk about in terms of data and how we can better collect sort of the on-the-ground viewpoints and so forth. At that national/global level, it's very difficult to do. But when we work on the ground, we do it in a completely different way. So we've been working in the Niger Delta for many years now, doing conflict early warning, but also building networks to respond. So the kind of work that we do in the Niger Delta is, first of all, to train community leaders, community groups to understand conflict early warning, to be able to collect their own data, and so that then gets collated into all kinds of things like conflict bulletins, heat maps, and so forth. But then what we also do is stakeholder network analysis. So what we look at the community and we determine, okay, we've worked out that there's these areas of fragility. When they turn into credible risks of violence or conflict, then we turn to stakeholder network analysis. And we think about who the influences are, where the entry points are, to be able to allow the community to respond to that fragility. And you look at it as a whole ecosystem. And I think that that's the difference of the community level versus the global level. At the global level, it's really, I mean, in many ways, it's another data point. Whereas at the community level, it's actually actionable. You can turn to the community to understand where the fragility is and to respond to it effectively.
Okay, I didn't see any other burning questions, so I'm going to sneak in my last two small points, and they're provocations to both of you. One is, with respect to new humanitarianism, one of the greatest mobilizers for action is not words, but images. And I'm wondering to what extent we can make use of those in new and different kinds of ways, precisely to tell your stories, and sometimes perhaps to counter the narratives that are out there based on images that don't necessarily speak truth, if you will, use that phrase. And the second is, you use the word ecosystem, and I think that's an accurate way of describing it, a very complex social and political and economic systems. And one of the things we know, whether it's financial markets or aircraft control systems, is that complex systems are subject to shocks, tipping points, and cascade effects that can lead to some very catastrophic consequences very quickly. They're not linear. And I wonder if you've done any work in thinking about systemic risks that might exist in these contexts and how to deal with those, as opposed to, trend lines that might be going up, might be going down, but still reflect a kind of linear notion of how social change operates. So that's kind of a couple of provocations for both of you to end on.
Sure. So I appreciate your attempt to provoke, but that's one of our favorite topics, to talk about images, but really more broadly, to talk about how to engage readers, and to a couple of the questions that came in terms of nuance and how do you unite the heart and the head. We go out of our way to include images with our stories. One, because we hope that it may attract the reader who might just happen to browse on our site. But two, because it's a different way of telling a story, of course, and you get a different depth of information. In terms of the power of images, I'll just tell you a quick story in terms of coverage of Yemen. In the United States last year, there was a recent study that came out that on the four largest networks, from which most of the population still gets their news, the coverage of Yemen totaled 20 minutes for the entire year. The story that got the most coverage, the international story that got the most coverage, I don't know if anyone wants to guess. No, but that's close. That's close. The story that got the most coverage was the story of the Thai soccer team who were stuck in the cave. One of the reasons that, and the thought is, one of the reasons that got so much coverage was it did exactly what we hope to do and what we can do to unite the heart and head, is that it was something that so many people could think about and imagine, oh my goodness, what if it were my son who were there? Second, there were images, there was video, there were photos, so people really didn't have to imagine, they could see. And third, it was a narrative, it was an ongoing story. So I think that's a lesson to all of us who are in the business of reporting, of covering, of trying to make sense of the world, that words are wonderful, but images and multimedia, and in fact our graphics, which you mentioned with our Tipping Points package, are fantastic. They're different ways to tell a story, and they add different nuances. You had asked about including nuance. Well, images, video, we often in our stories will embed audio. It makes such a difference to hear a voice when you're reading. So that's something we hope to do more of.
I'm kind of hoping he says you're going to do that on your website.
I think one of the challenges that we've seen in terms of in terms of imagery and also how we talk about countries is the concept of the dog that didn't bark. And if you look at resilience, for example, in many ways that is the dog that didn't bark. It's communities, it's individuals that are facing challenges and are demonstrating enormous resilience against them. And the challenge is, and I'm glad that we have the new Humanitarian, because I think that if anyone is equipped to be able to do this, is how to capture those images and to attract the kind of attention that we really need, and to really move the sort of fragile states coverage away from the sort of images that would be used in, say, charitable campaigns of, starving children, for example, give $10 now, versus the majority of people, the vast majority of people in fragile states who are enormously resilient and who are very capably facing up to those challenges. And how you capture those images, I think, is an incredible challenge. And I think that organizations like the New Humanitarian are facing up to that and are doing a very good job in doing so. In terms of the question around complex systems, and how we really approach the issue of fragility and resilience. First of all, notice I said fragility and resilience, because I think that more and more we need to couple those together, and we need to look at each in light of the other. And in so doing, we need to understand how they operate together, and also how they operate together within the paradigm of the state, and also how communities play such an integral role. And I think that more of a focus on the community level and away from the state level is what is going to ultimately get us there. I say that as I'm presenting the Fragile States Index. But I think ultimately, in the long run, this kind of data is very important, but really focusing on the community is where the real difference is going to take place.
Okay, thank you for that, and I'm now going to thank everyone for what I think was quite a rich discussion, starting, of course, with the Fund for Peace, represented by George, and Heba for the New Humanitarian, and I think also JJ for his presentation of the report and our responses and discussion, including from Josephine. So thank you for all of your inputs for this, material and intellectual, and thank the audience for participating in this.